A clean-up woman is a woman who gets all the love we girls leave behind.
History has provided us with extremely successful stories of courage, strength, and leadership. Yet sometimes we forgot just how extensive and diverse these stories are. So we're profiling some of the great black women in leadership today and those who exhibit a lot of leadership in the past also. You should recognize some of the strength. And again, this is going to be a very interesting program where we talk about these things. Again, welcome to a special edition of the Queen's Grapevine. This is your host, Wallingford Lee. Tonight on the Queen's Grapevine, we want to talk about leadership by black women in the community. It gives us a great deal of pleasure, and of course, to have a special guest who have been on our program many times, and she has been kind enough to accept our invitation to be in the program of talking about Assistant Professor Mary Phillips of the African American Studies at Lehman College. Welcome to our program.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's good to have you because we've done various programs and people continue to write us asking why you're not on. It's been a couple of months, so we want to talk a little bit about leadership in the black community from the female side. How strong are black women in terms of leadership?
Black women are very strong in terms of leadership. Black women have been the foundation of every major movement throughout history, right? If we go back, for example, to the period of slavery, and you look at the way in which black women were exploited as laborers, they were exploited as breeders, and they developed defense mechanisms to challenge all of this. For example, one of the ways that they did this is they developed the Female Slave Network, which was a network designed for survival, right? In which you had women who organized a system where they would tap into their strength. For example, some were midwives, right? If you needed help for whatever was going on a plantation and maybe you couldn't finish whatever labor that was, you had another black woman that will, take care of that. If you wanted to get rid of a baby because rape was happening in mass during that period, you had someone that can, do some concoctions to do that. And there was this huge support. That was the whole idea behind it, to support, to survive the assaults and the horrors, that developed during that period.
And that must have been a very difficult period for women, especially black women.
Absolutely, absolutely, right? And so there's a history of survival, there's a history of defense, there's a history of black women resisting when we look at that period all the way up. For example, when we look at the period of the Civil Rights Movement, for example, black women are often situated in the background, but they were leading this movement. They were there front and center leading this movement, right? And so it's extremely important when we look at, for example, the work of Coretta Scott King. Coretta Scott King is often talked about as the wife of Martin Luther King. And no one talks about her glory, right? And she was a huge activist in the civil rights movement. For example, a couple things about her. She is very talented. She went to school for music. She received her bachelor's degree in music education as well as her master's degree in concert singing. And she actually approached Josephine Baker to expand her vision of the civil rights movement. And Josephine Baker said no. And so Coretta Scott King took that on her own, right? And one thing we don't know about Coretta Scott King is that she was a huge supporter of the women's rights movement. So she understood the ways in which women's rights was integral, right, to the conversation of civil rights in and of itself. She attended feminist rallies. She was a huge supporter. She was there, front and center.
A lot of people kind of tend to think of her only as Martin Luther King wife. She's in the background. as a support. But you bring up some very, very interesting points about her.
Yeah, she was a huge supporter also of the LGBT movement.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
So she understood how all of these issues intersect and they make up who we are. When, for example, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, she was the one who went out and continued the march
The movement.
for city workers in Memphis, right? She did freedom concerts all the time, right?
And she also raised her children, too.
Yeah, and she did this while also being a mother, right? And so, you know, she has her own glory, she has her own activism that, you know, is separate from Martin Luther King's work that oftentimes get overlooked. But this happens, right? I mean, it's the same thing with Betty Shabazz, right? Betty Shabazz was a professor at Medgar Evers
Malcolm's
College.
wife,
right? And all we know is, you know, her being Malcolm X's wife.
And she's much more than just Malcolm's wife. I mean, tremendous woman, a true leader, an extremely educated lady also.
Absolutely. So Black women are very strong, right? We have been through so much, right? And so it's critically important that people know that.
What type of stumbling blacks and women go through to be a leader? Because we know it's not easy. Sometimes we men make the mistake of putting a woman just in the back. And I want to say right here in this program that most successful men have a strong woman, not behind him, but right next to him, helping him make decisions, helping him going forward. So make no mistake, a woman is not a backseat driver. So what are some of the stumbling blocks that a woman goes through to be a leader?
Yeah, and I'm very happy that you said not behind her, but
Right
side,
there.
right?
Yeah.
Some of the stumbling blocks, sexism, right? Patriarchy. We live in a very much a male-dominated space, right? So Black women are have to deal with various forms of oppression as it relates to their gender, as it relates to their class, right? And then you have Black men oftentimes not understanding this, who can oppress Black women, right? And so that becomes a major issue as well. So I would definitely say sexism, patriarchy, misogyny as well. This idea, because women in society in general are relegated as second-class citizens,
Yes.
right? And
it's wrong.
It's very, very wrong. It's oppressive. And I think sometimes because of male privilege, men take on this idea and treat women in a certain way that is very derogatory, that is essentially abusive, right? We live in a space where women don't even, there's a wage gap. Women don't even make the same amount as men. You can be just as qualified, even more qualified, and still not make the same amount as your male.
Because you're a woman.
Because you're a woman. It's offensive, you know.
And it's extremely difficult in yesterday's environment and in this environment to be a woman, because as Ms. Phillips just mentioned, the job market is one of the biggest things. Many times a woman is much more qualified than we men, and because she's a woman, she makes less money. Because she's a woman, she is not considered for the position sometimes, and she's the last to find out about it, and it's extremely wrong, and it should stop, especially with Black women, because there are a lot of great Black women that have made a difference. How difficult it is to climb the corporate world as a woman?
Well, I think it's very difficult. When you ask that question, I think of the racial hierarchical structure, right? And so you have Black women that are at the very bottom of the totem pole, right? Then you have Black men, then you have white women, then you have white men that are at the very top of the totem pole, right? And so for Black women trying to climb the totem pole, trying to prove their worth in an environment that devalues their total existence in many ways, it can be very challenging, right? It can be very challenging trying to navigate all of these obstacles and these barriers because you are a woman, right? As it relates to issues of sexism, for example, in the workplace, right? And then you also have issues of sexual harassment. I mean, these are all issues that women experience in general in the work environment that can be very oppressive. You have issues of bullying that may happen, right? Gender discrimination, like we mentioned, a wage gap. So all of these issues can be very difficult to kind of climb the ladder and
Not only
prove your
difficult,
worth.
also extremely stressful for a woman who plays various parts in her life, and sometimes we as men, out of our weakness, we don't recognize it. She's a woman, okay? She have to knock down all the bridges. She's a mother, okay? She got to come home, cook, take care of the kids. So it's not just a situation of just bearing children. She has to constantly prove herself in the professional world. Constantly, she have to deal with homework for her children and also be a mother and be present to back her man up or to be right next to him when he needed, because sometimes some men are weak. And the strength in the family happens to be a woman, and we don't say it, but it's a true fact. So a woman actually goes through a lot of things, and especially a black woman, because you mentioned also race factors that go through. How difficult it is as a community leader for a woman to run things, or we're into a point where she has adjusted and can get it done?
Well, most of these movements that happen locally in the community was because of women, right? Okay. But let's take, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, right? There were women who started this movement. Oftentimes, people do not understand or don't know that it was women who started this movement, black women in particular. Black queer women also who started this movement. And then when we think of Black Lives Matter, most of the conversation is centered around black men who were attacked by the police. Black women's assault by the police gets silenced in some ways, right? So we can list all of the men who have been, or the young men who have been brutally killed by the police. But oftentimes when we talk about black women, you know, there's, you know, when I'm talking to my class about it, many of them can't even say one name, right? They don't know the Renisha McBrides, right? They don't know all of these women who have been attacked. And so it's interesting how black women started the Black Lives Matter movement, but because of misogyny and sexism, they are pushed to the back, right, of the movement. When, you know, black women are assaulted by the police, you know, just as much as black men are assaulted by the police. And so they need to be talked about in the same conversation, right? Absolutely, absolutely. I think often it gets framed as a divide and conquer, but I think that's how the system is designed, so we can start attacking ourselves instead of really critiquing the system, right, that is oppressing us.
And it is. As we talk about these type of things, how important was the movement of Black Lives had a meaning? Because we know most women was right there carrying on. How difficult the movement was like that to put together?
The Black Lives Matter movement was extremely difficult to organize and to put together, particularly in this moment, right, where, you know, there's so much assault going on the black community. And so you have these activists that are trying to channel all of their energies, all of their resources to bring the community together. And we're removed from this day where, you know, during the civil rights movement, we had these key leaders who kind of led us, right? I don't think we really need that anymore, because there's so many leaders in our community, right, that are doing the work, that are on the ground, that are speaking, that are, you know,
that carrying on there.
Absolutely, that are carrying on the work that they are doing. And so I know that they dealt with a lot of obstacles, but we also are in this moment where there's tons of technology, right, that wasn't prevalent during these earlier movements, right? And so you have more resources at your disposal to organize at the same time, so.
And that key note, we'll be right back at the Queen's Grapevine as we continue talking about leadership of black women and also in the community. And one of the more important things, as Ms. Phillips mentioned about the movement of women, also we need to recognize that women are so much more educated today than they were 30 or 40 years ago. And my brothers and sisters, that's a very powerful thing. We'll be right back on the Queen's Grapevine as we continue to move forward.
Shirley Chisholm was the first African-American woman elected to Congress in the late 60s. She also was the first woman and the first African-American to mount a serious candidacy for the presidency of the United States of America.
Shirley Chisholm is the woman who ran for president, whose outreach, both in communities of color and to women, was remarkable.
She made real progress in this country, not because she wanted to be a politician, because she wanted to make change.
Certainly one of the heroes of big cities in the North, pioneers in education and healthcare and urban redevelopment, was Shirley Chisholm. Well, Shirley Chisholm was a person you'd love almost immediately. She always smiled. She was a bundle of energy. She'd been a teacher, so she related to children and adults very well and equally well. She evolved into politics through the state legislature and ended up in the Congress of the United States.
And we're back here in the Queen's Grapevine as we continue talking about not only the beauty of the black woman, but also the leadership of black women in the community and nationwide. We're very happy to have our special guest with us today, Professor Mary Phillips from Lehman College, who has been gracious enough to sit down and discuss this sensitive matter, which is extremely important. And as we move forward in the second part, we want to go back a little bit to talk about great pioneer women that made a difference and were one of the first in their class and in their profession. We could talk about Angela Davis, if time is allowed. We talk about Miss Chisholm, who was one of the first congresswomen out of Brooklyn, New York. There are just so many. We can talk about Diana Ross. We can talk about right now the Williams sisters, who are doing their own thing in the tennis court. So there are very, 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 very many women out there that we look up to and that have made a difference as an athlete, a singer, dancer, and more importantly, as a mother also. As I've always said in our program, a woman happens to be the mother of civilization, and we must recognize that and give them the kudos that are due to them. Who are some of the great women that you look up to when you was growing up?
One of the women that I looked up to was Ida B. Wells. She was an anti-lynching crusader, and she challenged this idea that black men were out there raping black women. So she actually used she was a journalist, she used their reports, right, to really challenge this idea. And her argument was that no, these were consensual relationships. Black men were not raping black women. And to do that during that time was very, very brave, right?
It took a lot of nerves, a lot of guts and intestinal fortitude. Come on.
Right. And she would often carry a Winchester rifle because she had to,
self-defense.
Absolutely, right? And so she's one of the women that I look up to. Also, Angela Davis. I've always looked up to Angela Davis. Angela Davis has been through so much. She was born in Alabama. She grew up in this area called Dynamite Hill, and it was coined Dynamite Hill because it was so many bombings that happened in that particular area. She actually recalls one of her earliest childhood memories was hearing the sound of dynamite.
Wow.
Right. Wow. Because it happened so much. Actually, in that area, before we get to the 1963 church bombing, there were 21 bombings that happened in that particular area before the church bombing had occurred, right? And so Angela Davis, she is highly educated, right?
Very much so.
Right. Has her PhD. She studied in Germany, right? She has tons of books out, right? And what we know of, she was a champion of the Soledad brothers, and that was 3 prisoners who were accused of killing a prison guard. And
matter of fact, that's how she came to be known, because I think she stood up to the system.
Right, she stood up to the system. Actually, George Jackson, who was, one of the members of what came to be known as the Soledad brothers, his brother, Jonathan Jackson, actually took control of a courtroom, and several members in that courtroom was killed, including the judge was killed. And they connected his weaponry with Angela Davis. They said that the guns were registered in her name. And so this is how she became what we know, right, of Angela Davis. There was tons of rallies and support the Free Angela Davis movement that occurred from that. And she was acquitted she got on the FBI's most wanted list.
Right,
she was actually the 3rd woman to be on the FBI's most wanted list. And she was acquitted of all charges in 1972.
Make no mistake, to back up what she's saying, the FBI really went after Angela Davis with everything that they had. And after it's all said and done, she was a free woman. And you need to know, those of you that read and know history, the entire black community and some of the white community was really behind her. And because she was an extremely educated woman, she stood up to them and probably kicked some of their tail a little bit.
Yeah, she definitely did, right? Ronald Reagan had it in for her, actually. She was a member of the Communist Party, and she was a professor, and actually he tried to get her, well, he at one time barred her from teaching at any school in California.
Wow.
And as we know, that is not the case anymore, because she is actually a professor at the University of Santa Cruz in the History of Consciousness program. But again, you know, the system was really trying to get her, particularly because she was a black woman, right?
As we continue talking about some of these pioneers, were Angela Davis part of the Black Panther, or she was just into the Black Power movement?
She was not an official member of the Black Panther Party. I think that is a misconception that she was in the Black Panther Party, although she worked closely with Black Panther Party members. Huey P. Newton, Elaine Brown, Erica Huggins. She worked with them, absolutely, but she was not an official member of the Black Panther Party, no.
Oh, she was never a member of the Black Panther. Well, you need to know, like I said to you, in the 70s, she had a big backing. The government went after her because they considered that she had committed a crime. Who are some of the other pioneers that influenced you otherwise than Angela Davis?
Many of the women of the Black Panther Party, for example, were a huge influence on me. Women were the Black Panther Party, right? Running the organization, much of the daily organizing was due to women in the Black Panther Party. So many of the women of the Black Panther Party, Erica Huggins, Elaine Brown, right, critical. Elaine Brown, for example, was chair of the Black Panther Party. Most people don't know that is one of the few predominantly male organizations that had a woman in power, right, from 1974 to 1977, right? And so her leadership and her work greatly influenced me. She has a book called A Taste of Power, where she talks about the ways in which, you know, she kind of ran the Black Panther Party and the challenges of being a woman in power, if you will. But she had a huge influence on me as well. And then women in my own family, right? My mother, for example, I learned a lot about life from my mother, right? A lot of wisdom from my mother, from my sister, right, from my aunt. So I had a lot of women as I was learning about women in history, and then women in my family.
You're part of the structure of your life.
Yeah, it was critical to the structure of my life, absolutely.
I was thinking about talking about the leadership of black women as in a family and in the community. Do you think the youngsters today understand the importance of what happened in the past and how these women influenced you and how strong they were and how they helped turn the structure of this nation? Do you think the youngsters today understand that?
You know, I think, you know, when I teach my classes, and the first thing particularly, I teach a class called Black Women in America. And I go in there the first day and I have them name me, you know, who were some of the key women that you have learned about throughout history. And many of them can't name any, right? You know, and that becomes problematic. Sometimes some folks do know Angela Davis, or they might say Rosa Parks or what have you, but many of them really have no sense of their own history, right? And the ways in which black women were critical, right, throughout history. If we're looking at the period of slavery on up. And so the class becomes this eye-opener, right? As it was, you know, women would greatly influence me. I mean, I got into black studies and particularly started studying black women's history because there's a silence around black women's stories and black women's history, particularly in black studies. So there's the struggle behind black women's studies and black feminism, right? And really bringing these stories to the forefront, right? So it has a huge impact. But I think a lot of young folks don't know the history the way in which they should know the history. So
that's scary because, you know, there's so many important women. You know, she mentioned Rosa Parks. If you really sit down and think about it, the step that Rosa Parks took back in 1955 has a lot to do with all the benefits that you minorities today have, those that come from abroad, because she stood up to the system. down south in the 50s. They went on a strike, okay, to show that black money made a difference and that we were not second-class citizens. That roller coaster into a situation where Dr. King came into the picture. And from there became all the movement, thanks to a woman, to Rosa Parks, okay? Credit where it's really truly due, and I hope your students understand that.
Yeah, and when they finish the class, they definitely know that as we're going through the class. And one thing about Rosa Parks has been written in history in a way that really doesn't represent who she is. And what I mean by that is she has been written in history as someone who was tired, someone who was exhausted. And that was not the case. All of this stuff was strategically organized, right?
Sure.
And she was very radical, right? She used to, have guns in her house, right, as protection. She used to travel the country, really trying to investigate the way in which black women were assaulted, right?
Wow.
There's a lot about Rosa Parks that has not been told, that is not kind of ingrained in the way that her history has been remembered. A key book that I would recommend the viewers to read is this book called The Radicalism of Rosa Parks by Jean Theo Harris. And she really reshapes
The situation.
Yeah,
that
and really talks about her as this radical, strong leader that was militant, that was unapologetic. And one key thing people don't know about her is that she used to visit the Black Panther Party's Oakland Community School.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
And
That's
so
new to me.
she was very radical. She admired Malcolm X, for example, right? She went to hear him speak one time and asked him to sign her program, right? So she believed in self-defense. She was very adamant about that.
When we talk about leadership, it's a word that's thrown around a lot. What does leadership is your interpretation of leadership?
Yeah, my interpretation or my definition of leadership is doing whatever you can do in your capacity to advocate for social change, right? And so it might be tapping into a kitchen tool, if you will. We talk about these kitchen tools, and there's something about black women braiding each other's hair and having some flyers sitting around and sharing these flyers and encouraging these students or whoever you're interacting with to come to this activist meeting or what have you. It is standing up for something. It is
Something that you believe in.
Yes, unapologetically. It is being bold. It is really adamantly trying to go against the grain in some kind of way to promote social change, right? So, we have to think, we're in society where everyone is pushed to be the same, to look the same, right? And we need to embrace differences, and we need to support each other, and we need to build communities and organize. And so being a leader is standing up for something, right? And doing something about that, yeah.
As we move forward, and we're talking about leadership and some of the things and how this country changed and the shape of it, how important to black women was the 60s and early 70s? Because we're talking about leadership. So much happened in the 60s, the voting rights, the civil rights movement, the black movement, the Panther movement. How important was the 60s, you think?
The 60s were critical. The 60s was so important, right? I think the 60s is this period of romanticism as well. The 60s was a very brutal period. But black women were central to those movements that happened. Sure. If we look at organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, if we look at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, if we look at any of these organizations, black women were doing all the work, right, basically, right? And not always getting the credit for the work that they were doing. And so it has definitely shaped the movement that we're in today, right? Each movement kind of builds on top of each other, and we can learn lessons from movements of the past. But the 60s was critical, right?
Not only critical, the 60s was a very important time in this nation. So many good things happened: music, movements, freedom of speech, where the youngsters stood up and said to this nation, we're not going to tolerate your nonsense anymore. We want to vote. We want to do the things that we want to do. The Vietnam War, there was so many things in the 60s. But as Professor Phillips just mentioned to you, black women in the 60s and even now continue to ring the bell. Is there a message that you would like to give to your students and to the youngsters of America as we talk about black leadership from the female standpoint of view?
Yeah, and that would be just to read. Continue reading. You know, I always tell my students to go to the library, dust off those books, right? Blow off the dust, and really sit down and read and take in as much information, because it's you know, so many students, there's so much information that students don't know, particularly about black women's history. And so I just think it's ever increasingly important that we continue to read, continue to elevate our consciousness about these particular issues.
And more importantly, to back up what she's saying, education is power. Education is something, if you educate your mind, no one can take that from you. Material things are good, but education is a plus, and it's something that you as a youngster should be extremely serious. And take the time to read books, and as the professor just mentioned, because all it can do is clarify your mind about doubts and things like that. Because there are certain things that other people don't want you to know: who you are, where you came from, and more importantly, why you should be proud of who you are. And again, Professor Phillips, on behalf of the family of the Grapevine, I want to take this opportunity to tell you thank you so much for being our special guest.
Thank you. And let me also add, while you said education is power, I'll also add that education is political, right?
Sure is.
Especially as, you know, black folks here in America, it becomes a political weapon, tool for liberation.
Yes,
absolutely.
And again, this is Wallingford Lee saying good night for the Queen's Grapevine and saying to you, thank you for watching our program. We hope to see you next week at the same time, at the same place, right here on the Grapevine. Good night.